Everyone knows the face, the perfect, ludicrous, impossible pout, the look that could stop a shuriken in midair. It's the face that launched 1,000 memes, a face that became a global icon of vanity, of stupidity, and of being really, really ridiculously good looking. It was Blue Steel. It was Le Tigre. It was Magnum. It was Derek Zoolander. But he didn't just appear out of thin air. He was created in the mind of a man who was his complete opposite: quiet, brilliant, and almost invisible to the public. His name was Drake Sather, a legendary writer, a comedic genius who shaped the laughter of the 90s. He was the architect behind the absurdity, the man who wrote every gloriously dumb classic line. But this is not a story of success. It is the tragedy of the man who wrote one of comedy's greatest jokes and couldn't survive his own punchline. To understand Drake Sather, you have to understand the world that forged him, the gritty, smoky, and fiercely competitive American stand-up comedy boom of the 1980s. It was a cultural gold rush where comedians were the new rock stars. While mainstream acts delivered relatable punchlines, a young Sather carved out a different path. His comedy wasn't loud or physical. It was cerebral, layered, and tinged with a signature cynicism. He was an observer, standing apart from the world and dissecting its absurdities with a surgeon's precision. This quiet intelligence earned him the deep respect of his peers, branding him a comedian's comedian, a term of high praise for a unique mind not quite built for the mainstream spotlight. As the 80s gave way to the 90s, the comedic landscape shifted. A new alternative comedy movement rose, valuing smart, deconstructive writing over simple jokes. In this new environment, the writer became king. Shows like The Larry Sanders Show and Mr. Show celebrated intricate, clever television. It was an ecosystem that was the perfect fit for a mind like Drake Sather's. It was in the writer's rooms of seminal shows that he would find his greatest success, his true calling. But it was also a world that demanded a relentless cleverness, an intellectual marathon that, for a man predisposed to melancholy, could become an exhausting and unsustainable performance. By the mid-1990s, Drake Sather had achieved a level of success that few comedy writers ever will. As a key voice on news radio, he was a respected architect of one of the most intelligent sitcoms on television, a creative nirvana for his unique, cynical mind. He was no longer fighting for a foothold. He was standing firmly at the center of a comedic revolution. But in the unpredictable ecosystem of Hollywood, a career is not a straight line. It was during this period of stability and critical acclaim that a seemingly minor side project would emerge, a one-off gig that felt like a fun diversion, but would ultimately pivot the entire trajectory of his life, defining his public legacy while simultaneously planting the seeds of his most profound professional and personal struggles. A phone call from a friend would lead him from the grounded reality of a New York radio station into the glittering, vapid world of high fashion, and nothing would ever be the same. The year was 1996. The cultural landscape was a strange and fertile ground for satire. The grunge-era angst of the early decade was fading, replaced by a resurgent wave of glossy poptimism and booming economic confidence. It was the era of the dot-com bubble, of irrational exuberance, and of a celebrity culture that was beginning to metastasize, thanks to the proliferation of cable channels and the birth of the 24/7 entertainment news cycle. At the center of this glossy universe was the world of high fashion, which had reached a new height of self-importance and public fascination. Supermodels like Cindy Crawford, Naomi Campbell, and Kate Moss were no longer just faces on magazines. They were global superstars, icons of a new inaccessible glamour. And within this phenomenon, a newer, even more peculiar subgenre was emerging, the male supermodel. Figures like Marcus Schenkenberg, Tyson Beckford, and Mark Vanderloo were becoming household names, celebrated for their chiseled looks and their stoic, often completely vacant expressions. They were presented in magazines and on talk shows with a profound seriousness that seemed wildly disproportionate to their actual profession. They were treated not as people who wore clothes for a living, but as philosophers of aesthetics, silent titans of style. The entire culture surrounding them, the ridiculous jargon, the inherent narcissism, the profound self-importance, was a target so ripe for satire, it was practically begging to be punctured. It was into this environment that the music channel VH1 decided to throw its annual Fashion Awards, a televised event designed to celebrate the intersection of music, fashion, and celebrity. It was by its very nature a self-serious and slightly ridiculous affair. In an attempt to inject some self-aware comedy into the broadcast and to gently poke fun at their own subject matter, the producers approached comedian Ben Stiller. Stiller was, at that moment, a rising star and a critical darling. His short-lived but brilliant Fox sketch series, The Ben Stiller Show, had established him as a master of sharp pop culture savvy parody. He needed to create a short satirical film for the award show, and to do that, he needed a character. More importantly, he needed a writer who understood the subtle nuances of cultural satire, someone who could build a joke with an architect's precision. He turned to his friend, a writer he admired for his singular dry wit, Drake Sather. The collaboration was a meeting of perfectly complementary comedic minds. Stiller possessed a manic high-energy performance style and a director's eye for visual gags. Sather, in contrast, was the quiet observer, the intellectual engine who could dissect a cultural phenomenon and find its comedic pressure points. Together, in a series of conversations and writing sessions, they tossed around ideas. They were both fascinated by the bizarre bubble of the male modeling world. It was a universe that operated on its own absurd logic, a place where a man's ability to pout his lips and stare blankly into the middle distance was treated as a profound artistic gift. According to Stiller's own consistent retelling of the story, the process was deeply collaborative, but the genesis of the character, the core of the joke, the name, the entire ridiculous concept, came directly from Sather. It was Sather who, in a moment of comedic inspiration, came up with the name Derek Zoolander. The name itself was a perfect piece of comedy writing, a miniature masterpiece of character creation. It sounded just plausible enough to be a real model's name, echoing the slightly European, vaguely aristocratic names often adopted in the industry, while simultaneously being utterly, irredeemably ridiculous. It was a name that perfectly balanced on the knife's edge between plausible reality and sublime absurdity. Sather's vision for the character was brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective. He envisioned a man who was the undisputed king of his profession, the Michael Jordan of male models, but who was also, in Sather's own blunt words, an idiot. He wasn't just slightly dim-witted. He was a man of profound, almost cosmic stupidity, a person defined entirely and exclusively by his surface. He was a walking, pouting embodiment of vanity with absolutely nothing, no thoughts, no feelings, no inner life, going on behind the eyes. Sather's core comedic insight was to take the perceived emptiness of the male model persona and treat it not as a subtext, but as the literal text. Derek Zoolander wasn't pretending to be vacant. He was vacant. The short film they created for the 1996 awards show was a smash hit. Stiller's portrayal of the dim-witted, pathologically self-absorbed model was hilarious, and Sather's writing was razor-sharp, perfectly capturing the nonsensical jargon and inflated self-worth of the fashion world. The character of Derek Zoolander, with his signature career-defining look, a look Sather and Stiller christened Blue Steel, was an instant comedic gem. It was a perfect, self-contained joke that landed with devastating accuracy because it was performed in the very temple of the culture it was mocking. They reprised the character for the Fashion Awards the following year, introducing a new, equally brilliant look called Le Tigre. And for a while, that seemed to be the end of it. It was a great bit, a successful side project for two busy professionals who had other, more important work to do. But the character lingered. There was something about Derek Zoolander that was too funny, too resonant, too perfectly constructed to just leave behind in a couple of short films. The idea of turning the character into a feature-length movie began to percolate. Stiller was keen to direct and star, recognizing the potential for a truly unique comedy. He brought Sather on board to co-write the screenplay, this time along with a third writer, John Hamburg, who would later go on to write and direct films like I Love You, Man, and Along Came Polly. For years, the trio worked on the script, a process that involved the immense creative challenge of expanding a 5-minute sketch into a 90-minute narrative feature. This is a notoriously difficult leap to make, one that is littered with the corpses of failed Saturday Night Live movies. A sketch character is built around a single joke, a single defining trait. To sustain a feature film, that character needs a world, a story, a motivation, and supporting characters who are just as funny. For Drake Sather, this was the ultimate test of his creative abilities. It wasn't just about writing punchlines. It was about world building. He had to take the brilliant, simple joke of stupid male model and construct an entire, internally consistent, and equally stupid universe around him. The result of that multi-year effort was a masterclass in comedic world building. They created the perfect rival for Derek, the new age, scooter-riding, blissfully idiotic Hansel, a character who represented a different, more relaxed brand of vanity. They invented the villainous, poodle-haired fashion mogul Jacobim Mugatu, a creature of pure, screaming affectation. And most brilliantly, they concocted the absurd, overarching plot involving an international assassination conspiracy, in which the world's most prominent male models are brainwashed to kill world leaders who threaten the fashion industry's access to cheap child labor. It was a plot so ludicrous, so breathtakingly stupid, that it was the perfect engine for Derek Zoolander's world. It was a story that could only happen to him. For Drake Sather, this was the culmination of everything he had been working towards. A feature film, based on a character he had conceived, was the ultimate validation in the Hollywood ecosystem. The film, simply titled Zoolander, was finally greenlit and produced and scheduled for release in September 2001. The timing, however, was catastrophic. It was a tragedy of scheduling that no one could have possibly foreseen. The film was released on September 28, 2001, just 17 days after the September 11th terrorist attacks. The entire nation, and indeed the world, was in a state of profound shock, grief, and fear. The appetite for a silly, gloriously absurd comedy about clueless male models was, to put it mildly, non-existent. The cultural mood was somber, patriotic, and deeply serious. Laughter felt like a betrayal. The movie was not a flop, but it was a significant box office disappointment. It opened to just over $15 million and faded from theaters relatively quickly. Critics were mixed, with many finding its silliness to be out of step with the grim national mood. Audiences reeling from a real-world tragedy that felt more immediate and terrifying than any fictional plot largely stayed away. It seemed that Derek Zoolander, the character with so much promise, the product of years of creative labor, was destined to be a minor footnote, a casualty of horrific timing in Sather's and Stiller's careers. But then, as the initial shock of the attacks began to recede and the world slowly, tentatively, began to search for reasons to laugh again, something strange and wonderful happened. Through word of mouth, and especially with its release on DVD and its endless rotation on cable channels like Comedy Central, the film began to find its audience. People discovered its relentless, joyful silliness, its endlessly quotable lines. What is this? A center for ants? And its surprisingly sweet-natured satire. The film wasn't mean-spirited. It was a goofy, loving parody of a ridiculous world. In the years that followed its disappointing theatrical run, Zoolander transformed from a box office underperformer into a full-blown, undeniable cult classic. It became a cultural touchstone for a generation, a film whose lines and characters were so deeply absorbed into the lexicon that they became a shared language. For Ben Stiller, who was already a major bankable movie star, the film's growing legacy was another feather in his already decorated cap. He was the face of the film, its director, and its star. The public rightly associated the character's success with him. But for Drake Sather, the story was infinitely more complicated. He had created this iconic character, he had co-written the film that made him a global phenomenon, but his name was not the one the public associated with it. He was the writer, the essential but invisible man behind the curtain, and as the cultural footprint of Derek Zoolander grew larger and larger, as blue steel became a go-to pose in photos around the world, the story of the quiet, brilliant man who invented him seemed to be fading further and further into the background. While his creation was on a clear, unstoppable path to comedic immortality, Sather himself was heading into a period of deep professional uncertainty and profound personal struggle. The punchline he had so brilliantly written was starting to take on a life of its own, leaving its author behind, alone in the shadows. This disconnect between his creation's rising star and his own private despair was felt deeply by those who knew him. To his colleagues, the people who sat beside him in the high-pressure cauldrons of television writers' rooms, Drake Sather was an enigma. He was universally and consistently described with a word that is often thrown around casually in Hollywood, but in his case was meant with a sincerity bordering on awe. Brilliant. It was the first word that came to mind for almost everyone who ever worked with him. But it was invariably followed by a string of quieter, more complex descriptors: reserved, gentle, melancholy, observant. He was a man who contained profound multitudes, a person whose public-facing work, some of the sharpest, most cynical and explosively funny comedy of his generation, stood in stark, almost jarring contrast to the quiet, deeply introspective, and increasingly fragile man his friends and collaborators knew. To fully appreciate the uniqueness of his presence, one must understand the environment in which he operated. A television writer's room in the 1990s, particularly for a network sitcom, was a battlefield of egos and ideas. It was often a loud, aggressive, and overwhelmingly masculine space, where jokes were shouted out, built upon, or shot down in a rapid-fire volley of wit. The loudest, quickest voice often won the floor. It was a performative space where writers were expected not just to write, but to be funny, to embody the comedic energy of the show at all times. Into this arena walked Drake Sather, a man who operated on a completely different frequency. Janine Garofalo, a titan of the 90s alternative comedy scene, who worked with Sather, remembered him as having a kind of gentle, almost calming, observant presence that was completely at odds with the surrounding chaos. He was one of those guys, she recalled in an interview, who didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room to be the funniest. In the hyper-competitive environment of the news radio writer's room, Sather's style was a study in contrasts. He would sit often for long stretches, silently listening to the cacophony of pitches and ideas. He would absorb the rhythm of the conversation, the shape of the scene being debated, and then, in a quiet, almost hesitant murmur, he would pitch a joke, a line, or a structural idea that was invariably smarter, funnier, and more elegant than anything that had been shouted out before. It would silence the room for a beat, a moment of collective recognition that a better idea had just entered the atmosphere. He wasn't performing comedy, he was practicing it, like a master craftsman patiently sanding a piece of wood until it was perfect. Ben Stiller, the man who would become the physical embodiment of Sather's most famous and enduring creation, spoke of him with a deep and lasting admiration that went beyond their collaborative partnership. He saw Sather not just as a gifted writer, but as a unique comedic philosopher. Drake had a very specific, dry, cynical, smart sense of humor, Stiller has said repeatedly over the years. He just had a way of looking at the world that was his own. He came from this place of observing the absurdity in everything. Their collaboration on Zoolander was born from this shared sensibility, a mutual love for deconstructing the absurdities of fame, fashion, and modern culture. Stiller provided the manic energy, the director's vision, and the pitch-perfect physical performance that brought Derek to life. But it was Sather who provided the soul of the joke, the unshakable intellectual foundation upon which the entire ridiculous, magnificent edifice was built. Yet beneath this respected and highly functional professional exterior was a man grappling with profound and persistent internal battles. The very same hyper-analytical intelligence that made him such a gifted writer also seemed to fuel a deep-seated constitutional melancholy. He saw the world with an unflinching, almost painful clarity, recognizing its hypocrisies, its follies, its vanities, and its fundamental, inescapable absurdity. For a comedian, this is a gift. It is the raw material, the very source of all great satire. But for a human being, living with that level of critical awareness 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, can be an unbearable and exhausting burden. The switch that allows you to see the joke in everything can become impossible to turn off, and eventually that relentless, analytical gaze can start to turn inward on you, dissecting your own flaws, your own failures, your own absurdities with the same merciless precision. By all external measures, Drake Sather had built a successful, even enviable life. He was married to his wife, Heather, and they had 2 young children together. They lived in a beautiful home in the Hollywood Hills, the geographical symbol of industry success. He had a career that had not only provided for his family, but had earned him the genuine respect and admiration of the entire comedy industry. He was, by any objective standard, a success. But depression, true clinical depression, does not care about external measures of success. It is an internal storm, a chemical imbalance, a persistent and suffocating darkness that can blot out the sun even on the brightest and most cloudless day. It is a disease of perception, one that whispers to you that your achievements are frauds, your happiness is temporary, and your failures are fundamental truths. Friends and colleagues would later say, after his death, that they were aware Sather struggled with periods of depression, that he had a melancholic streak. But the true depth and severity of his pain was something he kept intensely, almost hermetically, private. He was a man who communicated through a carefully constructed persona of witty detachment. To admit the extent of his suffering would have been to shatter that persona, a vulnerability that may have felt too terrifying to contemplate. In the world of comedy, there is an unspoken, deeply ingrained, and dangerous myth, the trope of the sad clown. It's the idea that the people who make us laugh the hardest are often the ones who are hurting the most. There's a certain tragic romanticism to it, a narrative that we find compelling, but the reality is far uglier and more pernicious. The pressure on a professional comedian is not just to be funny on stage or on the page. It's a constant ambient pressure to be the funny person in all situations. When your identity, your livelihood, and your social currency are all built on being witty, clever, and in control, admitting that you are overwhelmed by a sadness you cannot control can feel like a professional and personal failure. It can feel like a betrayal of the very persona you've so carefully built. For a man like Drake Sather, whose entire comedic voice was so deeply rooted in intellectual control and cynical detachment, admitting to a vulnerability as profound and seemingly irrational as crippling depression may have felt like an absolute impossibility. It was in this fragile state that Sather faced the complicated aftermath of Zoolander's release. As the film's cult status grew throughout 2002 and 2003, his career momentum, paradoxically, began to slow. Hollywood is a town built on heat, on buzz, on what's next. A film that becomes a cult classic on DVD is a cultural victory, but it doesn't generate the same kind of career heat as a massive opening weekend. The industry, in its relentless forward motion, had already moved on. Sather tried to capitalize on his most famous creation, developing a television pilot for a Zoolander series for VH1. This was a hugely significant move for him. It was his chance to finally step out from behind the curtain, to take a more central, public, and controlling role as a creator and showrunner. A successful TV series would have cemented his ownership of the character in a way the film never could have. It was his opportunity to be the primary voice, the guiding force, the public face of the world he had invented. The pilot was written and produced, but the network, in its infinite wisdom, passed on it. It was a brutal, and for a writer, very public, rejection. For any writer, a failed pilot is a painful but common experience in a career full of them. But for Sather, given the context, it seems to have been a uniquely devastating blow. The one thing that was supposed to be his ticket to the next level of success, the project that would finally give him unambiguous ownership of his own idea, had stalled. Meanwhile, the movie character was becoming more famous every day, inextricably and exclusively linked in the public mind with Ben Stiller. Sather was now in the strange, painful, and deeply ironic position of watching his own idea become a global cultural phenomenon, while he himself felt increasingly left behind and professionally marginalized. The phone didn't ring as often. The meetings were harder to get. In the relentless forward march of Hollywood, where a writer is only as good as their last credit, he was in danger of becoming yesterday's news. This deepening spiral of professional disappointment and personal depression was not happening in a vacuum. The pain Sather felt was real and internal, but its sources were amplified by the very industry in which he worked. To truly grasp the weight that crushed him, it's necessary to dissect the cruel ironies and unspoken rules of the world he so brilliantly satirized. The story of his struggle is not merely a personal one. It is a case study in the complex and often brutal dynamics of creative credit, the superficiality of fame, and the cultural machinery that can celebrate an idea while discarding its creator. The controversy surrounding Drake Sather weren't loud arguments or public feuds, but the quiet systemic injustices that haunt the unseen artists who give our culture its most memorable characters. The first and most significant point of contention is the fundamental, almost philosophical question of creation itself. Who, in the final analysis, created Derek Zoolander? The simple and legally correct answer is, of course, both Drake Sather and Ben Stiller, along with their co-writer John Hamburg, on the screenplay. Sather conceived of the character, the name, the core comedic premise, and the signature blue steel look. Stiller, with his singular comedic genius, embodied him, gave him a physical life, a voice, a walk, and directed the film that made him an icon. This is the nature of collaboration at its best, an alchemy where distinct contributions merge to create something greater than the sum of its parts. But in the court of public opinion, where legacies are forged, the actor almost always eclipses the writer. The face becomes the sole proprietor of the idea. When people think of Derek Zoolander, they see Ben Stiller's impossible pout, not Drake Sather's name on a script page. It is crucial to state that there is absolutely no evidence of any personal animosity or professional dispute between Sather and Stiller. By all accounts, their relationship was one of genuine friendship and profound mutual respect. Stiller has been consistent, generous, and unwavering in public forums and interviews, always giving Sather foundational credit for his role in creating the character. But that doesn't change the fundamental physics of fame. For a man like Sather, who was constitutionally quiet and never comfortable in the spotlight, this dynamic must have been a source of deeply complex emotions. To watch your most famous idea become a global icon, to see it bring joy to millions, is surely a source of immense private pride. But to remain largely anonymous yourself, to be the invisible architect of a world-famous landmark, could also be a source of profound, gnawing frustration, a constant reminder of the industry's skewed value system. This leads directly to a historical debate that haunts his story, the what-ifs of his career. Chief among them, what if the Zoolander television pilot he developed for VH1 had been picked up? The significance of this failure cannot be overstated. A television series would have given him a level of ownership, creative control, and public identity as a creator that the film, by its nature, never could. As the showrunner, he would have been the undisputed voice of the show, the final authority. It might have solidified his position in the industry, reignited his career momentum, and provided the tangible, ongoing professional validation he seemed to be searching for in the years after the movie's quiet theatrical release. Its failure wasn't just a career setback in a long line of them. It was the definitive closing of a door, the death of a parallel timeline that might have led to a radically different, happier outcome. Layered on top of this professional disappointment is the most profound and tragic irony of Sather's life. Zoolander is a brilliant surgical satire of a world that is pathologically obsessed with surfaces, with image, with fame for fame's sake. The central enduring joke is that Derek is an empty vessel, a beautiful man with no discernible inner life, whose value is determined solely by his appearance. The historical irony is that Sather, the man who so brilliantly diagnosed this cultural sickness, became a victim of the very system he was parodying. Hollywood, like the fashion world it so often mirrors, is a profoundly superficial place. It values heat, momentum, and celebrity above almost all else. It is an industry that often celebrates the surface and ignores the substance. When Sather's heat cooled after the initial release of the film, the industry that had celebrated his talent began to look away. He was an intelligent, complex, and deeply feeling man, in a town that often has little time or use for any of those qualities when they aren't attached to a bankable star. He wrote a masterful critique of a shallow world, and then that shallow world, in its indifference, effectively discarded him. The most difficult, painful, and persistent debate surrounding Drake Sather is the one concerning his death. When a person dies by suicide, it leaves behind a catastrophic wake of unanswerable questions for those left behind. Friends, family, and observers are left to sift through the wreckage of a life, trying to assemble a narrative that can make sense of the unthinkable. Was it the career disappointments that pushed him over the edge? Was it a lifelong intractable battle with clinical depression? Was it the unique high-stakes pressures of the comedy world, an industry that demands constant creativity and offers little stability in return? The truth, of course, is that it was likely all of these things and more, a perfect, terrible storm of professional anxiety, existential pain, and a chemical imbalance that colored everything in shades of gray and black. His death in March 2004 was a quiet tragedy, mirroring the quiet nature of the man himself. It was reported in the industry trade papers like Variety and The Hollywood Reporter. Brief obituaries dutifully noted his work on Zoolander, News Radio, and The Dennis Miller Show. But it did not become a major public event. There was no widespread cultural conversation about his death, no broad reflection on the immense pressures facing writers or the silent epidemic of mental health issues in Hollywood. He had lived his life primarily in the background, a respected name within the industry, but unknown outside of it. And in many ways, he died there too. This very quietness is in itself a source of historical debate and a sad commentary on our cultural priorities. Why did the story of the man who created Derek Zoolander not resonate more widely at the time? Perhaps it's because the narrative of the struggling, forgotten writer is less glamorous, less compelling to the public than that of the fallen movie star. Perhaps it's because suicide, then even more than now, was a topic that made people deeply uncomfortable, a tragedy that was easier to whisper about than to discuss openly. Or perhaps it's the most tragic reason of all. In the relentless, churning 24-hour news cycle, in a world already moving on to the next celebrity scandal or political outrage, the quiet death of a quiet man was simply and cruelly overlooked. The immense complexity of his life and the profound sadness of his end were flattened into a simple, tragic headline, and then the world moved on. The man who gave the culture such a memorable, enduring character was himself in the final act, largely forgotten by it. The debates surrounding Drake Sather's career, the questions of credit, the sting of professional rejection, the tragic irony of his life's work, all lead to a single, heartbreaking conclusion. The quiet man who had lived his life in the background was, in the end, left there. But historical analysis and cultural critique can only go so far in explaining the depths of a human tragedy. The quiet story of his professional marginalization found its final devastating punctuation mark on a March afternoon in the Hollywood Hills. It is in the wake of this final irreversible act that the true, complicated, and enduring legacy of Drake Sather can be fully understood. A legacy written not only in scripts and characters, but in the vital and painful conversation his life and death force us to have. On March 3, 2004, Drake Sather drove his car to a secluded spot in the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, not far from the home he shared with his wife Heather and their 2 young children. There, in the quiet of a late winter afternoon, surrounded by the physical geography of the industry that had both built him up and broken him down, the 44-year-old writer ended his own life. The cause of death, as determined by the coroner, was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. the news sent a ripple of profound shock and devastation through the close-knit comedy community. Those who knew him personally were left heartbroken, forced to grapple with the sudden violent loss of a gentle friend and the horrifying finality of his last act. Those who only knew his work, the razor-sharp scripts, the perfectly constructed jokes, were left with a deeply unsettling and unanswerable question. How could someone who created so much laughter, who so expertly understood the mechanics of joy, be filled with so much private, unbearable pain? The immediate consequence of his death was a profound and personal tragedy for his family, a private grief that stands apart from any public analysis of his career. But over the years, as the initial shock subsided, the broader significance of his life and death has slowly come into sharper focus, revealing a story with a deep, lasting, and increasingly urgent resonance. His legacy is not a simple one. It is a complex triptych composed of a ridiculously good-looking male model, a revolution in television comedy, and a difficult but vital conversation about the darkness that can hide behind the brightest lights. The most visible, enduring, and globally recognized part of Drake Sather's legacy is, without question, Derek Zoolander. In the years immediately following Sather's death, the character's fame, which had been steadily growing in a cult-like fashion, exploded into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. The film transitioned from a beloved oddity to a comedic touchstone, a universally acknowledged classic. Lines like, "What is this? A center for ants?" And "I'm pretty sure there's a lot more to life than being really, really, really ridiculously good-looking. And I plan on finding out what that is," entered the popular lexicon, quoted in dorm rooms, offices, and eventually across the burgeoning landscape of social media. The blue steel face became a go-to pose for an entire generation taking photos, a shared piece of comedic language that needed no translation. Derek Zoolander, the glorious idiot Sather had dreamed up for a one-off awards show sketch, had achieved a level of comedic immortality reserved for only a handful of characters. In 2016, 12 years after Sather's death, a sequel, Zoolander 2, was released. Ben Stiller returned to star and direct, bringing back the entire original cast. While the film was not as critically or commercially successful as its predecessor, its very existence was a powerful testament to the enduring power of the character Sather had created 2 decades earlier. The world of Zoolander had outlived its creator, a fact that is simultaneously a beautiful tribute to Sather's genius and a source of the most profound, heartbreaking irony. His creation, a perfect parody of vapid superficiality, had a longer, louder, and more celebrated life than the complex, sensitive, brilliant man who had dreamed him up. Beyond the long shadow of Zoolander, Sather's work as a television writer left an indelible and often underappreciated mark on the evolution of modern comedy. His contributions to shows like The Dennis Miller Show and, most significantly, News Radio were part of a crucial and transformative movement in the American sitcom. In the mid-90s, network comedy was largely dominated by broad, laugh-track-driven, family-friendly formulas. News radio, with its rapid-fire dialogue, its complex character dynamics, its embrace of workplace absurdity, and its deep intelligence, was a radical departure. It treated its audience as if they were smart, capable of keeping up with overlapping conversations and subtle, character-based humor. This was the groundwork, the very DNA, for the golden age of television comedy that would follow in the 21st century. The influence of that writer's room can be seen in the smart, fast-paced, and critically adored comedies that followed, from 30 Rock and Arrested Development to The Office and Parks and Recreation. Drake Sather was one of the quiet architects of that change, a key voice in a movement that made television comedy better, sharper, more ambitious, and more reflective of the world's true, chaotic absurdity. But perhaps the most important, most difficult, and ultimately most human part of his legacy is what his story tells us about mental health, particularly within the immense pressures of creative industries. His death was a tragic, real-world crystallization of the sad clown paradox. It was a brutal and undeniable reminder that the ability to create comedy is no defense against the ravages of clinical depression. In the years since his death in 2004, the public conversation about mental health has evolved dramatically. It has become more open, more nuanced, and significantly destigmatized, both in society at large and, crucially, within Hollywood. High-profile figures, from actors to musicians to comedians, now speak more freely about their own struggles with depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges, helping to dismantle the dangerous myth that vulnerability is a form of weakness. Drake Sather's story has become a quiet but powerful touchstone in these discussions, a cautionary tale about the immense pressure and hidden pain that can exist behind the scenes of the art we consume. It forces us to look beyond the finished product, the perfect joke, the hilarious script, the flawless performance, and consider the human cost of its creation. It highlights the profound vulnerability of the artists we rely on to make us laugh and think, and it underscores the critical importance of creating an environment where it is safe for them to admit that they are not okay. His tragedy serves as a powerful posthumous argument for empathy, for checking in on our friends and colleagues, and for remembering that even the most brilliant mind is still a fragile biological thing, susceptible to illness like any other part of the body. The deepest significance of Drake Sather's life is not just in what he created for us to enjoy, but in the vital, urgent conversation his absence inspires. In the end, we are left with a story of profound and unsettling contradiction. Drake Sather was a man who traded in a currency of cutting cynicism, but was, by those who loved him, remembered for his gentleness and quiet kindness. He was a writer who achieved the highest levels of success and respect in his chosen field, yet he felt in the end like a failure. He created a character who became a global symbol of joyful, idiotic absurdity, yet he himself was consumed by a private, relentless, and unconquerable sadness. His life was a testament to the fact that intelligence is not a shield. The ability to forensically dissect the world's follies does not grant one the power to fix their own. His mind, the very tool that allowed him to craft such brilliant, enduring comedy, may also have been the source of his deepest, most inescapable pain. He saw the world too clearly, and perhaps in the end, he saw himself too harshly. When we watch Zoolander today, it's impossible not to laugh. The film remains a masterpiece of inspired silliness, a perfect and joyful escape into a world of orange mocha frappuccinos, googolies, and gasoline fights. But knowing the story of its creator adds an indelible layer of deep poignancy to the laughter. It reminds us that every joke has an author, and every author has a story, often one far more complex and painful than the joy they create. It's a call to look past the punchline and see the person who wrote it, to appreciate the act of creation as the fragile human and often costly miracle that it is. Drake Sather's story is a tragedy, but it is not just a story about an ending. It is also a story about creation, about the quiet, often uncelebrated and deeply solitary work of bringing an idea to life. He gave the world a character that has brought untold joy to millions, a character that will likely be quoted and remembered for generations to come. In that, His creation achieved a kind of permanence that he, as a mortal man, could not. The ultimate irony and perhaps the ultimate tribute may be this: the Creator is gone, but the ridiculous, beautiful, idiotic creation lives on. He couldn't survive his own punchline, but he left it behind for the rest of us, a gift of laughter born from a life of quiet, heroic struggle. And for that, he should be remembered.